We need to understand that there's spiritual answers even to physical maladies in our life. And it was Jesus who said, when he was asked the question, what's the greatest commandment? In other words, what's the greatest thing that God has given us? What is the greatest command that God has instructed us with that guarantees success, that guarantees a life of abundance? And Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all of your heart. America is the most anxious and lonely nation in the world. Forbes Health reports the most common mental illness in the U.S., anxiety, is a significant issue that deserves attention as it has an impact on everything from workplace performance to personal relationships. Anxiety makes one feel isolated and usually leads to depression, end quote. Forbes Health is describing what appears to be the biggest problem in America today, and that's anxiety. And when you've heard people talk about having panic attacks, usually those are very closely associated with anxiety attacks. I've had panic attacks. I went through a period in my life in the late 90s and into the early 2000s of having panic attacks. And that is the freakiest thing I've ever been through. And you that are listening, if any of you have ever had a panic attack or an anxiety attack, you know that it is really, really frightening. For me at least, it was expressed through claustrophobia. So I would just be actually in a hotel room when it hit me, and it felt like the walls were closing in. I felt like I was losing my mind. And I wanted to go out of the room. So I did. I got on an elevator, and then I freaked out because I was on the elevator. And then I go down to the lobby, and that did not cure it at all. And I was so freaked out that I couldn't take the elevator back up to the 8th floor. So I walked the steps all the way back to the 8th floor, rightly thinking that exercise might help, but it didn't. Got back to the room, got into a fetal position on the floor, thought I was going to throw up, and then started crying. It was weird, man. And I called a pastor friend of mine. He said, hey, dude, welcome to the pastorate, you know. He said, why don't you take some Tylenol PM? So I got some Tylenol PM, and I got to sleep. He said, that's the only thing that's going to help it. And when I woke up, I felt better. But then I had to take a flight back to Colorado. I was actually in Southern California for a conference when this happened. But over the next few months, and I think it even extended into a year, I learned how to cope with these panic attacks and what to do when they came to curtail their impact on me. What I want to talk about is how do we find the ability and the power to overcome anxiety in our life and loneliness in our life. And this is a big, big, huge issue. And anxiety disorders are the most common mental illness in the United States and affect over 40 million adults, or 19.1% of the U.S. population. So can you imagine? That means 1 out of 5 people have anxiety disorders. America has 5 times more anxiety disorders than any other nation in the world. So we lead the world by 5 times in the area of anxiety, depression, and loneliness. Young people are more likely to experience symptoms of anxiety than older adults. With nearly 50%, this is like blows my mind, with nearly 50% of those between the ages of 18 and 24 reporting depressive disorder or anxiety symptoms. So that's in the entire population. Nearly 50% of Americans between the ages of 18 and 24 report depressing disorders or anxiety disorders in their life. Women are more than twice as likely than men to experience an anxiety disorder. Colorado, that's where I live, is ranked 3rd in the United States with 53.66% of people feeling nervous, anxious, and stressed at least several times during a week. Well, what about loneliness? In May 2023, U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy called loneliness a public health epidemic. The latest American Psychiatric Association, APA, finds that early in 2024, 30% of adults say they have experienced feelings of loneliness at least once a week over the past year, while 10% say they are lonely every day. Younger people are more likely to experience feelings of loneliness, with 30% of Americans aged 18 to 34 saying they are very lonely every day or several times a week. And single adults are nearly twice as likely as married adults to say they have been lonely on a weekly basis over the past year. And the numbers are 39% for singles to 22% for married. That's from the American Psychiatric Association 2024 report. Again, Dr. Vivek Murthy, Surgeon General of the United States, writes, quote, "Loneliness is far more than just a bad feeling. It harms both individuals and societal health. It is associated with a greater risk of cardiovascular disease, dementia, stroke, depression, anxiety, and premature death. The mortality rate of being socially disconnected is similar to that caused by smoking 15 cigarettes a day, and even greater than that associated with obesity and physical anxiety." So this is huge, men and women. This is a huge issue, this area of anxiety, as well as stress and even loneliness. Dr. Vivek continues, "Each of us can start now in our own lives by strengthening our connections in our relationships. Our individual relationships are an untapped resource. A source of healing is in plain sight. Our relationships can help us live healthier, more productive, and more fulfilled lives." Well, this is what the Bible's been saying for centuries, that we need each other, that God made us for connection, and that it's through connection that we can be healed of loneliness. We can be healed of anxiety in our lives. And what we tend to do in the American culture is run to drugs, some kind of a pharmaceutical. I mean, think of my story, what I told you earlier. My mentor, pastor friend, told me to take Tylenol PM. He said, "That's your cure right there, is take Tylenol PM." Now, I know what he was trying to say is that right now at 11 o'clock at night, you're having a panic attack, you've got to sleep. You're not going to be able to sleep without some kind of pharmaceutical to put you to sleep. So I get that. But I can tell you right now, my goodness, almost 30 years later, that there's a lot more he could have said about my relationships, about the stress I was under, about the pressure that I was feeling. But what he said was take Tylenol PM. Well, let me just tell you, Tylenol PM did solve the immediate problem, but that's not long-term what I needed. I knew that, and he knew that too. What I think is so important is that we need to understand that there's spiritual answers even to physical maladies in our life. And it was Jesus who said, when he was asked the question, what's the greatest commandment? In other words, what's the greatest thing that God has given us? What is the greatest command that God has instructed us with that guarantees success, that guarantees a life of abundance? And Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all of your heart. Love the Lord your God with all of your soul. Love the Lord your God with all of your mind. Love the Lord your God with all of your strength. And then love your neighbor as you love yourself. Love, love, love. You see, Jesus is saying that we're made for connection. We're made for relationship vertically and horizontally. We're built by God to find our most lasting impact through loving God with everything. Loving him emotionally, loving Him physically, loving Him spiritually, and even loving Him mentally. But it doesn't stop there. We're limiting our own happiness and our own joy and our own peace if we just are isolated in just loving God. Matter of fact, John in 1 John says, anybody who says that they love God but they hate their brother is a liar. So it's a vertical relationship that translates into horizontal relationships, that God made us for connection, not just with Him, but also with people. It's amazing that God in Acts chapter 1 comes down, and then into Acts chapter 2 comes down with the power of the Holy Spirit, and the church is birthed. In other words, it was a group. It was a group of 120 men and women seeking God. God comes down in power, and that begins the connectivity that became the local church and became the church that changed the world. From the 11 apostles to 120, to then 3,000, to then 5,000 more, 8,000, and then across the whole Mediterranean, the Spirit moved. And so God made us all for connection. And the importance of that is even noticed in the scientific research. Time magazine writes, quote, "Scientists have found again and again that those with spiritual practices in their life or who follow religious beliefs tend to be happier than those who don't. Study after study has found that religious people tend to be less depressed, less anxious than non-believers, better able to handle the vicissitudes of life than non-believers." In the passage that we're going to look at in the next episode in 1 Peter, Peter describes and provides us with what I'm calling the cure, kind of a cure for anxiety and loneliness in our lives. Some steps that we need to take that even scientific research is discovering is true. That people who have a spiritual connection with God, those that are involved in the church, those who are disciples of Jesus, just tend to do better. They tend to be more healthy people. They tend to have more resiliency. They tend to have a prayer life that leads to a fortitude and a endurance in difficult times that other people just don't have. I was on a phone call with a young man in his mid-20s yesterday who's in another part of the country, but he was calling, and it was related to some conditions that he was under. And I said, well, are you involved in any kind of a local church? Are you involved with some Christians? And he said, no. And I said, well, that's pretty important. And even if you're not seeking God and you don't want to be a God seeker right now, it just makes common sense that if you don't want to be isolated, if you don't want to walk around with anxiety all the time, that you need some good friends, some what we call bloodstained allies, but that you need that in your life. And so even the studies are showing that that's vital and important. So in the next episode, I'm going to talk about four things that are found in a particular passage written by Peter in his first letter that are huge in helping us conquer and overcome anxiety and loneliness in our lives. So go to the next episode, and I'll begin that process of breaking down what I think the Bible says breaks the power of loneliness and anxiety in our lives.